Have you ever written out your testimony? Or simply took the time to think through what you would say about the difference that Jesus has made in your life? Several times in our Act series, we've encouraged you to memorize Peter's words. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Have those words washed over you, or are you prepared? Clearly, the Apostle Paul was, with a little help from Luke. In Acts 9, Luke recounts for us the story of Paul's conversion. Later in chapter 22, mid-riot, Paul recounts the story himself, and then again in chapter 26 to Agrippa. Author and scholar N.T. Wright remarked on the repetition that either we say that Luke is a very careless editor and hasn't really thought about the effect of all this in such a work of literary artistry, or he has a strong motive for wanting his readers to understand Paul's own story well enough almost to be able to recite it themselves. That being true, some of us may have an easier time reciting Paul's story than our own. What is Luke's purpose then in repeating this story, having already told us and will eventually tell us again? Let's take a look at his words. The first thing Luke mentions is the silence as Paul addressed the crowd in Hebrew, as if they were surprised hearing their enemy in their own tongue. Paul continued, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today." And Paul's issuing his bona fides, and they're as good as they get. Gamaliel was the real deal as a rabbi, and Paul's remark regarding zeal alludes to Phinehas's zeal in Numbers 25, putting the blasphemer to death. He mentions the letters from the high priest, and while most listening had probably seen a high priest, likely few had interacted with him. Paul was his appointed instrument in stamping out this movement of the way. Now, taken together, I think Luke is reminding us of how far Paul has come. That he had once been a part of the mob, and yet the grace of God had so transformed him. He had not only become subject to their rage, but knowingly returned to Jerusalem to face it. Isn't it interesting that when Paul gets to the point of mentioning Ananias of Damascus, he doesn't call him a follower of Jesus, rather a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. Additionally, in this passage, we hear nothing of Paul's time in Arabia, as mentioned in Galatians, much less his evangelism in Damascus. Instead, he fast forwards to the temple. Paul's not lying. He's simply telling the details most meaningful to his audience and purpose. Now, as a practical point, we should consider the same when sharing our story. Now, they took it in. They weren't merely humoring him. They were trying to make sense of his message. And then Paul lit the fuse. "Then the Lord said to me, 'Go. I will send you far away to the Gentiles.' The crowd listened to Paul up until he had said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, 'Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live.'" I'm amazed that they didn't riot at Paul's mention of encountering the resurrected Jesus, or that the Lord spoke to him in the temple. They went ballistic when Paul intimated that the gospel is for everyone. Paul had to have known how uttering that line would result. And yet, as an ambassador of the gospel, he could not but do so. I pray that we follow Paul's example, that we would be prepared to give an answer, that we would share it in a way most meaningful to our audience, and finally, that we would not shy away from proclaiming all of it, even that which is most unpopular. Have a blessed week.